Hello, my name is Kara Whiting, and today we're going to be discussing evidence evaluation. Evidence evaluation can be a very challenging concept for new researchers. Please know that it takes practice. You'll have lots of practice throughout the semester, so please be patient. Your classmates and I are here to help. So why is evidence evaluation important? As researchers, our goal is to identify the truth. We want to understand the whos, whats, whens, wheres, whys, and hows of the past as accurately as possible. The way we accomplish this is through gathering clues found in the documents that have been left behind. Throughout this course, we will be examining different record types that contain the clues we are looking for. But just like how if you and I both witnessed the same car accident, we might have slightly different interpretations of what happened, these documents can sometimes contain conflicting information. Our job is to determine the most accurate account. We do this through evaluating evidence. There are 4 separate things that you need to consider with each new document that you will evaluate: the source, information, evidence, and reliability. We are going to go into detail about all of these in this presentation and explain how they all work together. It is important that you keep these terms with the appropriate classification. Sources are original, derivative, or authored narratives. Information is classified as primary, secondary, or indeterminate. Evidence is direct, indirect, negative, or no evidence. There will always be 3 classifications for each document that you evaluate. We will start with classifying sources. A source is the document, photo, or artifact that you are physically holding in your hand or viewing on the computer or microfilm reader. Sources will be classified as original, derivative, or authored narrative. In order to determine these classifications, we want to consider these questions. When was this document created relative to the event? Is the source based on a prior record? Does the source contain information from multiple sources? An original record was made at the time of the event or soon after. It has not been made based on a prior record. Examples of these are birth certificates created at the time of birth, a journal entry written near the time of an event, or a death certificate from the time of death. Original records can be facsimiles, photocopies, microfilm images, and digital images, as long as the image is legible and it has not been altered. So, to answer our 3 questions, an original record was made at or near the time of the event, but it is possible that it was written after the event, like a journal entry. But they are never based on any other record and do not contain information from multiple sources. A derivative record has been created from a prior record through transcription, translation, abstraction, or was reproduced with alterations. The most common example of derivative records are indexes that have been created of other records. As you research, you will also create your own derivative records as you summarize information you find within a record. To answer our 3 questions again, a derivative source may or may not have been created at the time of the event. They are always based on other records, and they do not contain information from multiple sources. An authored narrative synthesizes information from multiple sources and includes conclusions and interpretations from the author. These can include genealogical reports, compiled genealogies, biographies, and county histories. Our 3 questions again. An authored narrative may or may not have been created at the time of the event. It is based on prior records, and it does contain information from multiple sources. So let's take a look at our first example. This is a 1940 federal census. Our first question: was this source created at the time of the event or soon after? The answer to that is yes. This record was written around the time that the census was taken. Next, is this source based on a prior record? There may be some gray area with the census in particular, as this document is based on the census taker's notes, but generally it is accepted that this record is not based on any other prior record. Third, is it based on multiple sources? The answer is no. So we are able to classify this source as an original record. Now we have an online entry from the Western States Marriage Record Index. Note that its name gives us a clue to its classification. First, was this source created at the time of the event? Maybe, maybe not. From this image, we don't know when this index was created. Is this source based on a prior record? Yes, this index was created based on actual marriage records. Lastly, does it contain multiple sources? No, it only looks at the marriage records, so we will classify this as a derivative record. Again, every source you look at will be classified as either original, derivative, or authored narrative. This classification is completely separate and independent from any other classification. Our next classification is that of information. So information is the specific words that are contained within the source. When classifying information, we are most concerned with who provided the information that was recorded. We need to know the identity and the experience of the informant. Information will be classified as primary, secondary, or indeterminate. These classifications are specific to classifying information and are dependent on the informant. So the questions we will ask are, do we know the identity of the informant, or can we reasonably ascertain the identity of the informant? Is the informant an eyewitness to or participant in the event? Primary information is provided by an eyewitness to or participant in an event, and the informant must be cognizant of the event. This is a mother saying that she gave birth to a baby girl that she named Sarah on July 14, 1887. The mother was present and an eyewitness to the event. She participated in the naming of the child and knew the date in which the child was born. So considering our two questions, in order for something to be classified as primary information, we must know the informant, and the informant must have been an eyewitness. Secondary information is provided by someone who didn't or could not have seen or experienced the event. Someone had to tell them about it. If I am the informant on my mother's death certificate and write that she was born in Utah, I will be providing secondary information because I did not and could not have witnessed her birth in Utah. If we remember baby Sarah from the last slide, though she was present at her own birth, she was not aware of her own birth. So if later on Sarah says that her birth date is July 14th, 1887, she is providing secondary information because someone else had to tell her when her birthday was. Looking at our two questions, if we know the informant, but that informant is not an eyewitness, they are providing secondary information. Our third classification is indeterminate information. We use this when we cannot identify the informant or we don't know whether the informant witnessed the event. This is the only classification that can change as we gather more information. For example, a son may have been the informant on his father's death certificate and included the names of his grandparents, his father's parents. We do not know if the son knew his grandparents firsthand. Initially, we would likely identify this as indeterminate information. But as we later learn that the son grew up next door to his grandparents and knew them, we can change the classification as he would have known the names of his father's parents. Back to our examples, the 1940 federal census. We're going to look at the family of my great-grandparents, Mary and Oscar Whiting. Remember our first question. Do we know the identity of the informant? The 1940 census is unique, as it was the first census to identify who the informant was. Prior to this, we do not know who provided information on a census. It could have been the neighbor, it could have been a child, it could have been the head of the household or the wife or the mother-in-law. We just don't know. So all information is indeterminate. But here on the 1940 census, it is unique as we have an identifying mark indicating that Mary was the informant. Next, is the informant an eyewitness to the event? The information classification can change based on what information we are looking at. If we consider the names and ages of her children, Mary would have been an eyewitness to the birth and naming of her children, so we could classify this as primary information. Remember that we also keep our source classification of this being an original record. But if we look at Mary's age and birthplace, she is providing secondary information. Though present, she was not cognizant of the event, and someone else had to tell her when and where she was born. So this remains an original record, but is giving us secondary information about her birth. Within one record, we can have multiple classifications. It is important to evaluate each piece of information individually. And back to our marriage index. Do we know the identity of the informant? The actual marriage record might say, but from this index we do not know who the informant is. Nor do we know if the informant was an eyewitness to all of the information provided. So we will classify this as indeterminate information, again maintaining our source classification of this being a derivative record. If we were able to look at the original record and found that it did identify the informant, we might be able to change the classification to primary or secondary as appropriate. Finally, we will evaluate the evidence. Evidence will be classified as direct, indirect, negative, or no evidence. Classifying evidence is based on a specific question and how the information in the source answers that question. So, we need to ask these questions to determine our classification. First, identify what is the question to be answered. Does the source contain information that answers that question? Does the information directly answer the question with one piece of information? Can the question be answered using multiple pieces of information? Direct evidence directly answers the question with one piece of information. This is taking the question asked and being able to point to it with one finger to answer the answer written on the document that directly answers the question. We must always start with identifying the question that is being answered. Direct evidence will contain an answer to that question and do so with one piece of information. A source will also contain an answer to a question with indirect evidence, but it will not be as specific. If direct evidence, you can point to it with one finger. Indirect evidence requires the use of at least two fingers. Indirect evidence will give us clues to answer our question, but we must combine it with at least one other clue in order to arrive at our answer. Again, start with the question to be answered. Indirect evidence will answer that question, but not with one piece of information. It will require multiple pieces of information. Negative evidence can be a bit tricky. It requires that information you expected to be there was not, and it is the lack of information that is itself a clue that helps answers the question. Negative evidence is not the same as no evidence. Always identify the question to be answered. Negative evidence will not answer that question, but because you expected the source to answer that question, the lack of information is itself a clue. No evidence is simply that the source does not provide information that answers the question. It does not answer the question, you did not expect the source to answer the question, and you cannot arrive at your answer by combining multiple pieces of information. Back to the census. Remember, always start with the question. We will ask, how old was Ray in 1940? Does the source answer this question? Yes, it says he was 20, and I can point to it directly with one finger. So for this question, we will classify this as direct evidence, remembering our other two classifications, that this is still an original record and his mother is providing primary information about his age. But if we change the question to what year was Ray born, we will arrive at a different classification. This document still answers the question, but we now require two pieces of information: the age that his mother provided and the year of the census. We need two fingers to point to the information to answer the question. If we subtract 20 years old from the year 1940, we can estimate that he was born in 1920. In this case, with this question, this is still an original record with primary information, but we now have indirect evidence that tells us the year that Ray was born. If we change the question again to was Oscar living with his family in 1940, we will arrive at another classification. Oscar is not listed, but I expected to find him here because he was on the 1930 census. In this case, the lack of information can itself be a clue. Because he is not there, he might have died, been serving in the military, or divorced. In which case, to answer the question of was Oscar living with his family, we have negative evidence that he was not there. It is still an original record with primary information, but now classified negative evidence. This is not the same as no evidence. We expected to find information in the census to answer our question, and the lack of information gives us a clue. But if we change the question again to what year did Mary move to Utah, we will arrive at a no evidence classification. We find that the question is not answered in the census, nor was it expected to be. It shows that she was born in North Carolina, but there is nowhere for information to be recorded about the year of her move, nor is that something tracked by the census records. Again, still an original record with primary information, but there is no evidence in this record that answers the question of when Mary moved to Utah. Back to our marriage index. Identify the question. What day were Oscar and Mary married? The question is directly answered with one piece of information, and I can point to it with one finger. So while this is a derivative source with indeterminate information, it provides direct evidence of their marriage date. It is important to understand that these classifications can occur in any combination. You must classify sources, information, and evidence separately. So after all of this classification, how do you know if the source and information are providing reliable evidence? Best practice is to use original sources that contain primary information given by an eyewitness that provides direct evidence to answer your research questions. You cannot assume that all documents are most reliable, that all original documents are most reliable, or that all primary information is correct. Direct evidence, or that direct evidence is accurate. You must examine conflicting evidence individually. Some questions to consider regarding the reliability of your source. Why was the document created? How was the document used? How has the document been preserved? Has the document been altered? If the document has been altered, it will be less reliable. If it was not created for an official purpose, it will be less reliable. If it has not been well preserved and pages are missing, it will be less reliable. And we want to consider the information within the source. Is that reliable? We'll ask, why was the information recorded? Could there have been an ulterior motive, fraud, or reason to falsify information? Was the information given under stress or duress, for example, during a divorce or court hearing? Had significant time passed since the event occurred? Was the informant cognizant of the event? Is the information legible, or has it been altered? Are there errors, omissions, or inconsistencies in information? Is the information consistent with other sources? Again, this is a lot to take in, and you will have a lot of time to practice. Remember that you will be classifying sources, information, and evidence separately, and then considering the reliability of them all. This approach to evaluating evidence will help you most closely and accurately identify the truth.